I threw in with these guys, help them become successful gold miners. Look in front of you, you know. So it's time to step aside and let a younger guy get in that could use the job.
Well, we're sad to see you go, Chris.
In the brutal world of Gold Rush, legends aren't born in comfort. They're forged in mud, diesel, and near disaster. And among all the miners who've battled through breakdowns, blizzards, and impossible odds, Chris Doumitt stood apart. He wasn't just a crew member. He was the backbone, the calm in the chaos, the man who could turn a pile of scrap metal into a working machine when everything else failed. But even a legend can be pushed past the edge.
That's not good at all. Yeah, that pump can't run any slower. So we're going to have to do something else.
And in a moment that shocked fans and miners alike, Chris Doumitt got brutally fired by Parker Schnabel in one of the most explosive behind-the-scenes collapses in Gold Rush history. People always assumed Chris was untouchable. He'd survived the Hoffman disasters, rebuilt machines that should have been thrown away, and saved entire seasons with nothing but grit and a welding torch. But this time, the pressure wasn't coming from broken machinery. It was coming from Parker himself.
Gold all line up in there. There's gold along here. It might be a lot of work, but maybe these riffles are working.
And when Parker Schnabel is under extreme stress, when the gold isn't flowing and millions of dollars are on the line, even the most loyal crew members can find themselves in the crossfire. What happened next would tear open one of the most unexpected and shocking chapters ever linked to Chris Doumitt's firing. Before we dive deep into this insane story of conflict, betrayal, and the moment that pushed Chris out of Parker's shadow, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our community of Gold Rush theorists, mystery hunters, and behind-the-scenes explorers. Trust me, what you're about to hear is something Discovery Channel never wanted to spell out on camera. Because the truth is this: the firing wasn't a simple argument. It was a collision of ego, pressure, and buried tension that had been simmering for far too long. The hard-working veteran versus the unstoppable young boss. A clash of two very different worlds. And when it finally erupted, it created one of the most shocking off-screen meltdowns ever associated with the franchise. So sit tight, because this is Chris Doumitt got brutally fired by Parker Schnabel. Gold Rush, the unseen story, the off-camera truth, and the moment that changed everything. For more than a decade on Gold Rush, there was one man viewers quietly trusted more than any other. Not the dreamers, not the risk-takers, not the hot-headed leaders who gambled millions on a hunch. The real spine of the operation was always Chris Doumitt, the steady, unshakable craftsman who could pull a miracle out of a broken machine and a handful of bolts. Fans saw him as indestructible, a miner forged from tougher steel than the equipment he repaired. He was the man who didn't crack under pressure, didn't complain when the temperatures plunged, and didn't walk away even when seasons collapsed around him. Chris wasn't just part of the story. He was the quiet hero who held it together. But even legends fall, and Chris's downfall didn't come from failure, incompetence, or lost passion. It came from something far more shocking: being pushed into a situation he could not escape. A moment where loyalty, experience, and reputation suddenly meant nothing. Under Parker Schnabel, a young boss with impossible goals and the weight of millions riding on every decision, Chris found himself in the crosshairs of pressure he could no longer absorb. It was a clash nobody expected: the wise veteran versus the relentless prodigy. And when Parker finally snapped, the man who once carried entire crews on his shoulders was discarded like a replaceable rookie. The question that still haunts fans is simple: How does a miner like Chris Doumitt, who saved more seasons than anyone can count, end up being pushed out so brutally? His firing wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was the turning point of a story built on exhaustion, overlooked loyalty, and the crushing demands of Schnabel's empire. Chris, who had always been the calm in the storm, suddenly found himself trapped inside one he didn't create. And when the blow finally came, it hit with the full force of a crew under fire, a boss on edge, and a system that rewards pressure over experience. What happened behind those scenes remains one of the most debated collapses in Gold Rush history. A legend fell, not because he failed, but because the world around him had become too ruthless to value what he brought. And once Parker made his choice, there was no going back. Chris had stepped into a battlefield where even heroes get broken. But Chris's downfall is only the beginning, because to truly understand why this explosion happened, you have to step into the one factor nobody ever talks about: the pressure building inside Parker Schnabel himself, the pressure that created the perfect storm. The night Chris walked away, the camp didn't just feel empty, it felt unstable. Parker had always believed that tough decisions kept a mine alive, but even he didn't realize how quickly the fallout would hit. Within hours of Chris's departure, the mine shifted from a well-oiled operation into something unpredictable, tense, and dangerously fragile. Machines that had worked flawlessly all season suddenly began failing in sequence. A loader jammed. The wash plant choked on oversized rocks Chris would have filtered out, and the night shift's morale collapsed faster than the pay dirt piles stacking up in the wrong cut. The silence Chris left behind wasn't peaceful. It was an echo of something broken, something drifting out of control. But the real trouble began when Parker reviewed the night's footage. Camera logs showed inconsistencies, missing timestamps, unexplained gaps, and one eerie moment where a shadow moved across the equipment yard long after the crew had clocked out. At first, Parker brushed it off: fatigue, stress, overthinking. But the more he replayed the footage, the more the truth pressed into him like cold steel. Somebody had been there, somebody who wasn't supposed to be. And the question that twisted the knife deeper was the one Parker didn't want to say out loud. Was Chris Doumitt's exit just bad timing, or was someone taking advantage of the chaos Parker created? By sunrise, the camp was buzzing with rumors. Mechanics whispered about loose bolts found on a water pump. A rookie swore he saw headlights in the distance after midnight. And one of the veterans muttered the words no miner wants to hear on a high-pressure cut. Something doesn't add up. For the first time in years, Parker felt the ground beneath him shift. Not physically, but in the one place he always relied on: control. The mine wasn't just fighting back. Something inside the operation was unraveling. And what made it worse was one chilling thought he couldn't escape. If Chris had still been there, none of this would have happened. But the nightmare was only beginning. Because as Parker scrambled to regain control, a far bigger discovery was coming. A discovery buried deep under the Yukon mud that would expose secrets the crew never imagined. When dawn finally broke, the Yukon felt different. Not just colder, but heavier, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Parker stepped onto the claim with the weight of a sleepless night pressing against his shoulders. He tried to focus on production numbers, on pay dirt values, on anything except the chaos triggered by Chris's disappearance. But the mine had its own plans, and it was about to hand Parker the one truth he'd been running from. It began when the excavator on the far cut hit something unusual. The bucket didn't scrape gravel, it jerked to a sudden stop. as if it had grabbed onto something solid, something unnatural. The operator signaled Parker immediately, and within minutes, he was standing at the edge of a deep trench, staring at an exposed metallic shape. Not a boulder, not old mining scrap. Something else entirely. At first, Parker thought it was a crushed pipe from a past operation. But as more mud was cleared away, a pattern emerged. Weld seams, reinforced plating, and a fracture line that looked strikingly familiar. Too familiar. It took only seconds for Parker's stomach to drop. It was the same hydraulic housing Chris had warned him about 3 weeks earlier. Chris told him the part was cracked internally, that it needed replacement, and that running it under heavy load could trigger catastrophic equipment failure. But Parker, under pressure and obsessed with hitting impossible gold targets, brushed the warning aside. He ordered the crew to push the machine harder, to keep running, to deal with repairs later. Now the evidence of that mistake was staring him dead in the face, half buried in frozen earth. The worst part wasn't the broken equipment. It was what the break had covered. Because beneath the shattered housing was something even more shocking. A vein of ultra-high-grade pay dirt that had pooled and compacted in a way only catastrophic equipment failure could reveal. In other words, Chris had been right, both about the danger and the gold. The irony cut deeper than any argument the two had ever shared. If Parker had listened, if Chris hadn't been pushed out, if the crew hadn't been fractured, they would have hit this pocket weeks earlier, a pocket rich enough to change the entire season. As Parker crouched beside the Discovery, the cold seeped into him, not from the Yukon air, but from guilt. Every miner on the ground knew what this meant. The silence wasn't just awkward, it was condemning. The rookie who stood near the trench lowered his gaze. The camera crew didn't dare speak. Even the machines seemed to idle quieter, as if they too recognized the gravity of what lay beneath the mud. For the first time, Parker realized that firing Chris hadn't solved a problem. It had created one. And now, standing above the gold, Chris predicted, he felt the full weight of a decision he couldn't undo. Yet this discovery was only the beginning of the unraveling, because what Parker didn't know, what the crew would soon uncover, was that the truth buried beneath the Yukon wasn't just about gold. It was about the message Chris left behind, a warning, a clue, and the beginning of a deeper mystery no one was prepared to confront. When a veteran miner leaves a claim, the dirt settles, the engines cool, and eventually the noise fades. But the traces of a man, like Chris Doumitt, never disappear so easily. His absence wasn't just felt, it echoed. Tools lay where they shouldn't. A welder cart was parked at a strange angle, and in the far corner of the mechanical shed, a work light burned through the night, even though nobody had switched it on. For days after Chris was gone, the crew tiptoed around the subject, pretending the operation could function normally. But deep down, everyone sensed something unfinished, something Chris would have never left without addressing. And it wasn't long before Parker stumbled on the clue Chris had hidden in plain sight. It began innocently, almost accidentally, when Parker entered the welding shed to double-check inventory. A notebook lay on Chris's old workbench, half open, the pages ruffled as if someone had flipped through them quickly. The cover was ordinary, a worn leather binding stained with years of grease and Yukon dust. But what caught Parker's eye was the final page, a page torn, halfway out, hanging by a single fiber. Written across it, in Chris's unmistakable, steady handwriting, were 6 chilling words. "If you find this, stop digging." Parker froze. The cabin heater hummed softly behind him, But for the first time all season, he felt cold. This wasn't a joke, not a note left by some tired miner scribbling half awake after a long shift. Chris Doumitt wasn't the type to leave cryptic warnings unless he meant every single word. But that was only the beginning. Alongside the note was a folded equipment inspection sheet, one Parker remembered dismissing weeks earlier. Chris had circled 3 machines, not the ones normally prone to breakdown, not the unreliable old diesels everyone avoided. No, the machines Chris highlighted were the heart of Parker's premium pay dirt operation, the ones sabotaged the night Chris walked out. And below the circled equipment list, Chris had written something even more disturbing. Someone else has been working after hours. Parker's breath caught. The missing camera footage, the unexplained shadow in the equipment yard, the loose bolts, the damaged housing. This wasn't paranoia anymore. Chris had seen something big, something he tried to warn Parker about. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with quiet urgency. As Parker read deeper into the notebook, the picture sharpened. Chris had logged unusual fuel usage on nights the machines were supposedly shut down. He had recorded footprints by the southern pond that didn't match any of the crew. He had drawn a rough map of the claim's perimeter, marking 3 locations with question mark symbols, each representing a place where he believed the intruder had been operating. By the time Parker reached the bottom of the page, his pulse was pounding. Chris had added one final line, a line that wasn't a warning. It was a plea. This mine isn't breaking down. Someone's trying to break you. The words hit harder than any confrontation they'd ever had. Chris hadn't been trying to undermine Parker. He hadn't quit out of frustration. He had left because he knew something was coming, something dangerous enough that staying silent might cost lives. As Parker closed the notebook, a single question tore through him. Had he fired the one man trying to save the operation? Silence filled the shed as the realization settled. The discovery of the gold pocket, the sabotage, the missing footage, and now this notebook. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't mechanical failure. It wasn't stress. It was a pattern. Someone was burrowing into Parker's season from the inside, and Chris had seen it before anyone else. He'd tried to warn Parker, but the message had arrived too late. What Parker didn't know yet was that everything Chris predicted was about to escalate. The Yukon is known for its cold, its storms, and its dangerous terrain. But nothing unnerves a mining crew more than the idea that someone is moving through the darkness unnoticed. Someone familiar enough to avoid cameras, precise enough to tamper with equipment without leaving obvious signs, and bold enough to return again and again after midnight. For days, Parker carried Chris's notebook like a weight in his pocket. Every page sharpened a single terrifying realization. Whoever was sabotaging his season wasn't just reckless, they were calculated. And the moment Parker began to accept the truth, the patterns snapped into focus. This wasn't random mischief. This wasn't a disgruntled rookie. This was someone who knew mining, someone who understood Parker's workflow, his gold pathing, his fuel cycles, someone who had a reason to strike exactly where it would hurt him most. The first break in the mystery came from an unexpected source, Big Red's pump crew. While performing routine maintenance, they found something wedged behind the intake screen, a small metal fragment, shaved clean on one side like it had been filed deliberately. Under a flashlight beam, the truth emerged. This wasn't a natural break. It was engineered. By the time Parker arrived, the crew stood in a tense semicircle around the evidence. Nobody wanted to say it, but the look in their eyes told him everything. They were scared. Parker glanced around the yard. The mine looked normal. Machines idling, loaders moving dirt, the sun glinting off wet gravel. But beneath that thin layer of normalcy, the crew knew the truth. There was someone out there, operating quietly, methodically, and with a purpose. As Parker studied the metal fragment, a memory surfaced, something Chris had mentioned in passing just days before the blow-up. This doesn't feel mechanical, it feels intentional. At the time, Parker dismissed it, assuming stress had gotten to him. But now, with this metal sliver scraped smooth like a signature, he understood. Chris wasn't guessing. He had already found signs of tampering before Parker even realized the season was slipping. But the next revelation was even worse. Late that night, while reviewing old drone footage, Parker noticed something that made his skin crawl. A set of tire tracks, fresh, narrow, unfamiliar, running parallel to the main access road but never actually using it. Whoever was coming onto the claim was avoiding the cameras, avoiding the crew, and driving a compact ATV that none of Parker's men owned. Someone was slipping in from the old tree line, someone who didn't want to be seen. Parker took the footage to Mitch. The two pored over it for nearly an hour before Mitch finally exhaled sharply and said the words Parker had been avoiding. This wasn't meant for us. It was meant for Chris. And suddenly, everything clicked. Chris had warned him. Chris had documented the signs. Chris had left a message because he knew someone had been watching him. The sabotage didn't start when Chris left. It started before he walked out. It started when Chris got too close to discovering the truth. The more Parker pieced together, the more the cold reality settled into him. The saboteur wasn't trying to break a machine. They were trying to break the one man who could expose them, Chris Doumitt. But now, Chris was gone, and the saboteur was still out there, watching, waiting, planning their next strike. The mine wasn't just unstable, it was compromised, and Parker realized with a growing sense of dread that this wasn't about gold anymore. It was personal.